Genesis chapter 15 tells us a very important message. For the first time in the Bible, the gospel of justification by faith is introduced. In other words, the gospel that one receives salvation through faith alone first appears in verse 6. Abram believed the Lord, and the God counted it as Abram's righteousness. Apostle Paul's letters, all the letters can be described as the footnotes of this verse. Because men are innately evil, there is no one who can be righteous before God by the works written in the law. Since there is no one who can be righteous by keeping the law, God provided a new way to become righteous. That is, if one believes in Jesus, one will freely get the righteousness of Jesus and become righteous. That is the gospel of justification by faith that Paul brings forth in his letters. Abram thus showed, Abram in his life, as we know, he showed some flaws, some imperfections, but there was also some highly recommendable acts that God would have lifted him for. When God ordered him to leave his father's land, he obeyed. Abandoning one's status quo and comfort zone and taking off to unknown land is a very difficult challenge. It is a great act of obedience, but God did not call Abram righteous for this act of obedience. Also, Abram gave up all his rights and possessions when there happened a conflict with his cousin Lot. Abram allowed Lot to have the better land, but even then, God did not call Abram righteous for his selflessness. Later, when Lot was captured during the war, Abram took his army and saved him. On his way from the war, Abram offered his tithe to God's priest Melchizedek. But even then, God did not call Abram righteous. What does it mean? It means that God did not call Abram righteous for his works. In verse 6 of today's passage, God calls Abraham righteous for his faith. The reason behind calling Abraham righteous is described starting verse 1. God appeared to Abraham, but this is not the first time God appeared to Abraham. God appeared to him a couple of times in the past. God also blessed him in the past. Today's text, God appeared to Abraham again and blessed him again. Do not be afraid, Abraham, I am your shield, your great reward. We would imagine that Abraham was deeply moved by God's blessing. But we can see in the text, Abraham is complaining in his response. Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless? And the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, you have given me no children, so a servant of mine will be my heir. We can see here that there is a deep-seated ungratefulness in Abram's heart. Even though God promised Abraham that he would make a great nation through him, in reality, there was not even single child to Abraham. He was conflicted by the fact. He was struggling between God's promise and the reality he was facing. But God appeared once again and blessed him again. I am the one who rewards you. So Abraham responded, what kind of a reward? Do you know what I want? What I want? Do you know what I need? The reward you can really can give me is the child you promised. You promised that you would make me an ancestor of many people and great nations, but the reality is that I do not have a single child. I am so desperate and frustrated that I am considering my servant to be my heir. So God called Abram outside and told him to see the sky, the vast sky, and asked him, can you count how many stars are in the sky? And promised again, so shall your offspring be. Your descendants will be so many, like the stars in the sky. Abraham, this time, believed again. He believed again. God promised the same promise in the past, but it never accomplished. So Abraham was discouraged. He was struggling why God's promise is not accomplished, why God appears again and repeats the promise but never accomplished his promise. But Abraham this time believed again, and God called Abraham righteous. Abraham believed God's promise because it was God's promise. When did this promise come true? We know that this promise came true when Abraham was 100 years ago. Abraham received this promise for the first time when he was 75 years old, and he waited 10 years, stayed faithful to God's promise that he would make a great nation. But in Genesis chapter 16, Abraham failed and got Ishmael from his wife's servant. He was 86 years old then, and he waited 50 more years. And during that 25 years, God promised the same promise many times, but never accomplished the promise. But Abraham still believed God's promise, and God called his faith righteous. God seemed unfair. Why did God force Abraham to be so worrisome? He simply promised many times without any accomplishment. We cannot understand God. We hope that God's promise is accomplished, come true immediately or very quickly. But God gave Abraham the promised son when Abraham reached an age impossible to have any child on his own. Aren't we just the same? We are the same. When our faith is strong, we believe God's grace is responsible for all those good things. But we think about it again in disbelief. All those good things seem like being done by our own strength. That's why God does not accomplish his promise until the promise can be done by the help of God. Only by help of the God. God waits until then. Abraham's faith in God's promise was the beginning and still have a long way to go. The gap between God's promise and its accomplishment needed to be filled with Abraham's patience and Abraham's faith. In today's passage, God gave Abraham another promise. What was it? I will give you land. This promise was not the first time either. When Abraham first came to Canaan, God had already promised to give the land to his descendants. When Lot, the nephew, left after taking the good land, God again said, look around the land from where you stand. To the north, to the south, to the east and west. All the land you see, I will give you and your offspring forever. But because of a famine in the land, Abram turned his back toward this promised land. Later, when Abram's wife died, Abram had no land to bury his wife. Abram didn't have that small land to bury his wife, so he had to buy a cave from the heathen. He mostly resided in tents, wandering like stranger. But God would appear before Abraham from time to time and would promise him that the land would be provided to you. In today's passage, Abraham's unhappiness can be seen once more. In verse 8, he asks, Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of it? Abraham was looking for a sign, proof. Here God ordered him to gather animals like cows, lambs, birds, and break them into halves and place them facing each other. Abram followed God's orders and waited for the sign to be shown. While chasing the crowds away, Abram fell into a deep sleep. During sunset, when it was getting dark, Abram saw a smoking fire, and the torch came from the smoke, and the torch went past the broken animals. That was the sign that God gave to Abraham. The question is, what does it mean? Do you know the meaning of the Old Testament and New Testament? What's the meaning of Old Testament and New Testament? Some people say it is old medicine and new medicine. 구약, 신약. Sorry. Well, the Old and New Testament means Old and New Covenants. Covenant is the concept that goes through the Old and New Testament. That is the axis. Covenant in Hebrew is berit, and it came from barat, the verb. In English, we use the term to make a covenant. But in Hebrew, they use the term barat berit, to cut the covenant. Why they say to cut the covenant? It is because in the ancient Near Eastern world, when the Lord and servant make a covenant, a treaty, they went through a ritual in which a body of an animal was cut. The ritual in the suzerain vassal treaty represented that if the promise were to be broken, the one experienced the death like the animal. The promise broker will experience the death like the torn animals. It was a pledge to death. It was a cursed ritual in which you would walk in between the cut bodies of the animals and pledge to death that I will be killed like these animals if I do not keep the promise. The covenants in the Bible are classified into two covenants. Those are the covenant of grace and the covenant of works. The covenant of grace and the covenant of works, depending on who is responsible for the curse of the broken promise. In the covenant of grace, the curse is kept responsible by God. Even when man committed sin, God receives the curse. On the other hand, in the covenant of works, man receives the curse that comes from the sin committed by man. In today's passage, Abram killed the animals as God ordered him and put the cut bodies of the animals facing each other. Abram was fully aware of the meaning of those settings. It was common at the time in the ancient Near East. Abram was fully aware of that. The one who went through it was making the pledge to death. But who walked through the thorn animals? Was the Abraham or was God? In verse 17 it says, when the sun was set and the darkness fallen, a smoking fire spot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. It was not Abraham, it was God. That means God would be responsible for the broken covenant. Therefore, the covenant between Abraham and God was the covenant of grace. When God made the old covenant with the Israelites, there was a ritual too. In Exodus chapter 24, Moses took the book of the covenant and read it aloud before the people. And the Israelites solemnly swore, we will obey every command that God has given us. Then Moses took cow's blood and sprinkled it to the people, declaring, this is the blood of the covenant. Here it was important that the blood of the covenant, the blood of the curse, was sprinkled to the people. That meant if the covenant was broken, the punishment would fall on those who committed the sin. Therefore, the old covenant, Mosaic covenant, or the law, is the covenant of works. The covenant of works, unlike the covenant of grace, is conditional. Those who are under the law must keep the law to avoid the curse. Those who are under the law must keep the law in order to be saved. So Galatians chapter 3, verse 10 says, cursed is everyone who does not continue to do everything written in the book of the law. Under the law, salvation is conditional upon the works of man. When Apostle Paul says in Galatians chapter 3, verse 17, that the covenant was 430 years earlier than the law, he was referring to the covenant that God made with Abraham in today's text. The reason why the covenant of Abraham was important is that it points to the covenant of grace made on the cross by Jesus Christ. The characteristic of the new covenant of the cross is that God's Son, Jesus Christ's body was torn, was broken, and his blood was shed for the sins. The cross shows the sacrifice God made to save us. When Abram demanded a sign of accomplishment of the promise, God showed Abraham the cross by passing through the cut bodies of the animals. We can also ask God for a sign. God, how should we know that we will be saved? We will be the descendant of the heaven. Please show us. Then the sign that God provides us is the cross, the self-cursed cross that Jesus took. It is the reassuring sign that God provided us. The cross where Jesus shed blood shows us God's judgment, but it also represents a great grace of salvation that God provides to those who believe in Jesus Christ. Christians must remember the cross when fears and anxiety of this world overcome them. What was the first word that God said to Abraham? Verse 1, do not be afraid, fear not. To Abraham, who demanded a sign, God showed him a torch passing between the animals. There are moments when fears and worries overcome us. There are times when we are tired and frustrated because God's promise is delayed. But the sign of God that provides to us is the cross. when we take the cross as a sign of God, designed for us to show His unconditional love, His comfort, the comfort this world cannot give us will come to us. The same God who told Abram, "Do not be afraid, I'm your shield, I'm your great reward," tells us today, do not be afraid. To all of you who look the cross, I hope that all the fears are lost and the peace of God will protect your heart and thoughts in Jesus Christ. Amen.